42 hours, April 18, 1944. Air Ministry Building, Whitehall, London. Squadron leader Arthur Hensley was 36 years old and already tired of rumors. He stood at the long oak table in Conference Room B, tunic pressed, tie tight, cigarette unlit between his fingers. On the wall behind him hung a large map of Western Europe, pins clustered over the Ruhr, Hamburg, and Berlin. Red strings marked bomber routes, blue strings marked fighter cover. The room smelled of tobacco, paper, and damp wool. At 08:43, the projector flicked on. A grainy photograph appeared on the screen, blurred, elongated, clearly taken from altitude. The aircraft looked wrong. Its wings were straight. Its engines sat under the wings instead of on the nose. No propellers were visible. Hensley cleared his throat. Reconnaissance photo taken over Lechfeld Air Base, Bavaria, March 26th, he said. Altitude approximately 27,000 feet. Camera aircraft, Spitfire PR-11. A murmur moved through the room. Across the table, Group Captain William Carruthers leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "A jet," Carruthers said flatly. "Again." At 08:45, Hensley clicked to the next slide. Another image. Same aircraft, different angle. Reports from resistance sources and intercepted German communications suggest the Luftwaffe is flight testing a turbojet-powered fighter. Designation Messerschmitt Me 262. Carruthers exhaled sharply through his nose. "We've over this, Arthur. The Germans can barely keep piston engines running with their fuel shortages. A jet fighter is fantasy. They don't have the metallurgy, they don't have the fuel, and if they did, it would burn itself apart on takeoff." Several men nodded. Hensley hesitated. "Sir, with respect, our American counterparts have logged encounters." "Unreliable," Carruthers cut in. "Bomber crews seeing things at 20,000 feet while flak bursts around them. They mistake speed for novelty. It's the same story as the rocket fighters last year." At 08:47, Carruthers tapped ash into a tray. "Conclusion," he said, "no immediate threat. Continue monitoring." The lights came back on. The meeting ended at 08:49. Hensley returned to his desk with the uneasy sense that something had just been missed. 09:17 hours, same day, 21,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Captain Kincaid adjusted his oxygen mask and stared out across the sky. He was 24 years old, pilot, 8th Air Force, 401st Bomb Group. Aircraft B-17G Flying Fortress Lucky Lady, serial number 42-31527. The bomber stream stretched ahead and behind him, hundreds of aircraft in tight formation, silver in the morning sun. Each carried up to 6,000 pounds of bombs. Each flew at roughly 150 miles per hour indicated airspeed. Each relied on mutual firepower for survival. At 09:19, the first flak burst appeared. Black puffs at 12 o'clock, then more, heavy, accurate. Kincaid's navigator called out corrections. The formation tightened. At 09:23, the radio crackled. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high, fast." Kincaid leaned forward. He saw nothing at first. Then, movement. A gray shape crossed the formation from right to left in seconds. No propeller blur, no engine smoke, just speed. "What the hell was that?" the co-pilot said. At 09:24, the first bomber exploded. The aircraft disintegrated in a flash of flame and aluminum. Wings sheared away. The fuselage vanished. He felt it in his chest before he understood it. At 09:25, another pass, another bomber fell. The gunner screamed over the intercom. "It's coming back! Jesus, it's fast!" The attacker fired once. 4 30mm shells struck the B-17 ahead of Lucky Lady. The aircraft folded in half. The shape vanished in seconds. No dogfight, no warning, just impact. 09:26 hours, Lechfeld Air Base, Bavaria. Major Walter Novotny pushed the throttles forward. Novotny was 23 years old, rank Major, unit Kommando Novotny. Aircraft, Messerschmitt Me 262A1A. Twin Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines spooled behind him, each producing 1,980 pounds of thrust. The acceleration was slow at first, dangerous, vulnerable. At 180 kilometers per hour, Novotny eased the stick back. The Me-262 lifted cleanly from the runway. Gear up, flaps in. At 09:28, he was climbing through 10,000 feet at over 500 kilometers per hour. By 09:31, he was above the bomber stream. The Me-262 weighed roughly 14,000 pounds loaded. It carried 4 Mk-108 30mm cannons in the nose. Each shell weighed nearly a pound. One hit could destroy a bomber. Novotny rolled inverted and dove. Closing speed exceeded 500 miles per hour. He fired at 600 meters, a short burst. The bomber disintegrated. Novotny pulled up, climbing away without slowing. No Allied fighter could catch him. 10:03 hours, Air Ministry, London. Hensley sat alone, reading a decoded signal intercept. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. New jet unit operational. Heavy bomber losses confirmed. Speed exceeds interception. He stood and walked quickly down the corridor. At 10:07, he knocked on Carruthers' door. At 10:08, Carruthers read the intercept. At 10:09, silence filled the room. "How many?" Carruthers asked. Hensley swallowed. "Initial estimates suggest 15 bombers lost in under 10 minutes. Carruthers looked up slowly. "At what altitude?" 20 to 25,000 feet. "And speed?" "Witnesses report over 500 miles per hour, sir." Carruthers leaned back. The room felt smaller. By February 1944, Allied bombing of Germany had reached a critical phase. The combined bomber offensive aimed to destroy the Luftwaffe, cripple German industry, and force the Reich into collapse. Daylight raids by the USAAF struck ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants. Night raids by the RAF burned cities. Losses were heavy, but acceptable. Until the jets appeared. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was not a prototype. It was real, it was operational, and it was killing bombers faster than any fighter before it. British intelligence had seen the pieces. They had simply failed to assemble them. 11:38 hours, Schweinfurt. Captain Kincaid turned for Haim with half his formation missing. His aircraft carried holes in the fuselage. One engine ran rough. His tail gunner was silent. The sky behind them was empty. No German fighters followed. They didn't need to. The Me-262 was not perfect. Its engines lasted barely 25 hours before failure. Throttle response was slow. Runways were vulnerable. Fuel was scarce. Pilots were few. But in the air, at speed, it changed the equation. By the end of April 1944, Allied bomber crews had a new word: jets. They spoke it quietly. Back in London, Arthur Hensley stared at the map and understood the cost of dismissal. The war in the air had just shifted, and no one was ready.
War documentary. 0612 hours, May 12, 1944. Debden Airfield, Essex. Lieutenant Colonel James Buck Harrington stood on the wet concrete apron and watched the P-51 Mustangs warm their engines. He was 31 years old, fighter group commander, veteran of North Africa and Sicily. He had buried friends shot down by Messerschmitt Bf-109s and FW-190s. He understood German tactics. He understood altitude, energy, and angles. What he did not understand, yet, was how to fight something that could not be caught. At 06:15, an intelligence officer briefed his pilots. "New threat aircraft," the officer said, pointing to a chalkboard sketch. "Twin-engined, jet-powered, estimated top speed over 500 miles per hour, heavy nose armament." Murmurs spread through the room. One pilot raised a hand. "So what's the counter?" The officer hesitated. "There isn't one, not in the air." Harrington folded his arms. "Then we'll kill them on the ground." By mid-May 1944, Allied intelligence finally accepted the reality of the Me-262. Photo reconnaissance confirmed multiple jet units forming in southern Germany. Signals intelligence intercepted frantic German requests for aviation fuel, spare turbine blades, and trained pilots. Reports from bomber crews aligned. Loss rates spiked during brief, violent encounters. The aircraft's strengths were clear. Speed, over 540 miles per hour at altitude. Firepower, 4 30mm cannons firing explosive shells. Climb rate, superior to any Allied fighter once airborne. Its weaknesses were equally clear: takeoff and landing, engine fragility, fuel scarcity, political interference. The last factor proved decisive. June 4, 1944, 22:18 hours. Berghof, Obersalzberg. Adolf Hitler listened impatiently as engineers spoke. He fixated on one phrase. "Schnellbomber," he repeated. "Fast bomber." The Me-262, Hitler insisted, would strike London. It would carry bombs. It would terrorize cities. It would be a weapon of vengeance, not defense. Engineers protested. Pilots protested. Luftwaffe commanders protested. The jet was an interceptor, a bomber killer. Every kilogram of bombs reduced speed and climb. Every delay allowed Allied air superiority to tighten. Hitler overruled them all. Production lines were altered. Modifications delayed deployment. Training suffered. Time bled away. 0841 hours, June 7, 1944, Normandy coast. One day after D-Day. Allied aircraft filled the sky. Fighters, bombers, transports. The air over France belonged to the Allies. From a camouflaged strip near Juvincourt, 2 Me-262s lifted into the morning haze. They climbed fast. At 0846, they struck a formation of RAF Typhoons. The engagement lasted seconds. One Typhoon exploded. Another spiraled into the sea. The jets vanished inland before escorting Spitfires could react. On the ground, Allied commanders took note. The invasion continued regardless. The jets were too few. By mid-July 1944, the Allied response was systematic. Airfields identified as jet bases were bombed relentlessly, runways cratered, dispersal areas strafed, fuel dumps destroyed. Me-262s were hunted during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing. P-51 Mustangs orbited near known bases, waiting. At 0222 hours on July 18, 1944, Harrington's group caught their first jet. The Me-262 was low, gear down, speed reduced. Harrington dove. He fired a short burst of his 6 half-caliber machine guns. The jet caught fire and cartwheeled into a field. The pilot did not survive. It was not a victory in the air. It was an execution on approach. Despite losses, the Me-262 continued to inflict damage. On August 24, 1944, jets of Jagdgeschwader 7 intercepted a bomber stream over Merseburg. They destroyed 12 B-17s in under 5 minutes. American gunners reported hits that did nothing. The jets were gone before defensive fire converged. Morale suffered. Bomber formations tightened. Escort fighters flew closer. Tactics adjusted. Still, the jets came. Major Walter Novotny became the symbol of the new weapon. Already a celebrated ace, he adapted quickly to jet combat. High-speed passes, no turning fights, one attack, then disengage. By November 1944, he had claimed multiple four-engine bombers in the Me-262, but the pressure was immense. Jets required long runways. Allied fighters circled constantly. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Mechanical failures killed pilots without enemy contact. On November 8, 1944, Novotny's Me-262 suffered engine failure on landing approach. P-51s attacked. Novotny crashed and died. Germany lost one of its best. By early 1945, the strategic situation was irreversible. The Me-262 had arrived too late and in too small numbers. Roughly 1,400 were built. Fewer than 200 were operational at any one time. Allied industry dwarfed German output. Fuel shortages crippled flight operations. Training pipelines collapsed. Yet the jet left a mark. Bomber losses attributed to Me-262s were disproportionate to their numbers. Pilots who survived encounters never forgot them. After the war, Allied engineers studied captured jets in detail. Swept wings, engine placement, high-speed aerodynamics. The future was obvious. Arthur Hensley, still at the Air Ministry, wrote his final wartime assessment in April 1945. He concluded, the German jet fighter represented a technological leap. Its impact was limited not by concept, but by timing, leadership decisions, and logistics. He paused before adding a final line. Dismissal proved costly. As the Reich collapsed, Me-262s were abandoned on runways, burned by their crews, or captured intact. The war ended, but the age of the jet had begun.
War documentary. 09:54 hours, May 8, 1945. Lechfeld Air Base, Bavaria. The runway was silent. Burned-out hulks of aircraft lined the dispersal area, blackened frames of what had once been the most advanced fighters in the world. The concrete was scarred by craters and scorched by demolition charges. A white flag hung from a control tower window, limp in the morning air. Captain Edward Mallory of the Royal Aircraft Establishment stepped carefully between debris. He was 40 years old, aeronautical engineer, civilian rank. He carried a notebook, a tape measure, and orders stamped top priority. At 09:57, he stopped in front of a largely intact Messerschmitt Me-262. Its skin was scorched but unbroken. The engines were still mounted. The nose guns were empty but present. Mallory ran his hand along the fuselage. "This," he said quietly to no one, "is the future." In the weeks that followed, Allied technical intelligence teams combed through Germany. Airfields, factories, design offices, wind tunnels. They recovered blueprints, test data, and aircraft. British, American, and Soviet teams competed openly now, racing to claim what the war had concealed. The Me-262 was shipped in pieces to Farnborough, Wright Field, and Moscow. Every rivet mattered. The Allies learned quickly.
The swept wing delayed compressibility at high speeds. The underwing engine nacelles simplified maintenance and protected the fuselage. The nose-mounted cannon maximized destructive power. They also learned what had gone wrong. The Jumo 004 engine relied on low-grade steel alloys. Heat tolerance was poor. Turbine blades warped and cracked. Throttle movements had to be gentle. Aggressive acceleration destroyed engines. German engineers knew this. They had simply lacked time. Arthur Hensley attended the first post-war briefing at Farnborough on July 2, 1945. Charts lined the walls, performance graphs, cutaway engines. At 10:14, a test pilot spoke. "Climb rate exceeds anything we flew during the war. Control response is excellent at speed. However, engine reliability remains unacceptable by our standards." Hensley listened without speaking. At 11:03, he wrote a single note in the margin of his pad. "We laughed." The pilots who had faced the jets struggled to explain them to those who had not. Captain Robert Kincaid survived the war. His final mission ended in February 1945. He returned home thin, older than his years, with flight hours etched into his face. When asked about the Me-262, he was precise. "You never saw it coming. You never chased it. You just lost men. Then it was gone." He never flew a bomber again. Across the Atlantic, the United States accelerated jet development. The P-80 Shooting Star flew in 1944, but matured after studying German designs. The British refined the Gloucester Meteor. The Soviets reverse-engineered captured engines and airframes. Doctrines changed. Speed replaced turning fights. Altitude and energy became dominant. Bomber defense strategies evolved around radar, missiles, and escorts capable of matching jet performance. The Me-262 had not won the war. It had rewritten it. In Germany, surviving pilots returned to civilian life. Some became engineers, some instructors, some disappeared into anonymity. The aircraft they flew became museum pieces. One Me-262 sat behind ropes at the Deutsches Museum. Another rested at the Smithsonian. Children stared at them without fear. The shape was no longer alien. It was familiar. Arthur Hensley retired in 1953. He never commanded aircraft. He never fired a weapon. But his final lecture at the RAF Staff College ended with a slide of a grainy reconnaissance photograph. Never dismiss the improbable, especially when your enemy is desperate. The lights came up. No one laughed. Today, the Messerschmitt Me-262 is remembered as the first operational jet fighter. Not perfect, not decisive, but undeniable. It arrived as bombers fell from the sky and vanished as the war collapsed beneath it. A glimpse of the next war, appearing briefly in the last year of the old one.